Hello and welcome back to another Dungeon Saga painting tutorial. In this video I'll be showing you how you can paint the Dwarf Warrior Rordin using the Army Painter's range of paints and brushes. So here we have Rordin, and as you can see I've already primed it with the Army Painter's Matte Black Spray Primer. Now the first task of painting this miniature is to paint all of the metal areas with gunmetal. Now normally I would leave the metallic areas till last, but with the metallic areas being the predominant feature on this miniature, I've decided to paint them first. So for this step I'm using my regiment brush, and I've mixed a small amount of water into the mix just to improve the flow. I'm just going to be painting this across all of the metal areas, just being sure not to overspill it if I can onto the areas which I'll be painting with non-metallic paints such as the beard and also the skin. So now that all the metal areas have been completed, we can now start with the washes. Now I'll be washing over all of the metal areas with strong tone ink. So once again I'm using my regiment brush for this wash, and I'll just be applying this over all of the metal areas, applying it quite liberally as I want to create an almost bronze style kind of metal effect on the metal there, making sure I get it into all the recesses. So next we'll be applying a second targeted wash into all of the recesses, and for this we'll be using dark tone ink. So for this step I'm using my character brush. This is a little bit thinner than the regiment brush I used previously, and I'll just be targeting this wash into all of the recesses just to improve the shading, and you can see here I'm just painting it into the edges like so. So the next step is to apply some highlights to the armor, and first we'll be using plate matte metal and I'm applying this along the edges of the metal areas. So once again I'm using my character brush. I'm just going to be focusing this highlight onto all of the edges of the metal and just along there, just gently dragging the brush along until it creates a nice shiny silver edge. So the next step is to now paint the quilted cloth areas, and for this we'll be using deep blue. So for this stage I'm once again using my regiment brush, and I've mixed a small amount of water into the mix just to improve the flow, and I'll just apply two thin layers as opposed to one thick one, and this should just give me the best coverage. So I've also got the area on the back here, but also the quilted area also extends to the front as well. So once the base coat is dry, we can now start highlighting the quilts, and for this we'll be using crystal blue. So for this step I'm using my detail brush, and I'll be focusing the highlight onto the top corners of the quilts just like so, and doing this across all of the quilts both on the front and the back of the miniature. So once the highlight is complete we can now apply some shading, and for this we'll be using a wash of blue tone ink. So for this step I'm using my regiment brush again. I'm just going to be applying the wash over all of the blue areas, and this will allow us to create some shading as well as blending the highlight and the base colour together. So for the next step we'll be base coating all of the leather areas. Now this includes the boots, the gloves, the belt, and also the wooden handle of the hammer as well. And for these we'll be painting them with oak brown. So for the boots I'll be using my regiment brush again. However, when I'm painting the belt and also the handle, I'll probably use my character brush as it's a little bit smaller and these areas are a little bit more fiddly to reach. So the next step is to highlight the gloves, boots, and also the leather belt with leather brown. So for this step I'm using my character brush again. I'm just going to be focusing on the raised areas such as the fingers here. I'll just be lightly dragging the brush along there just to create a nice highlight. So continuing with the leather areas, we'll now be performing a extreme highlight, and we'll be using Monster Brown. So for this stage I'm using my detail brush, and I'll be focusing this highlight on the very tips such as the knuckles here, just picking those out individually. And then also on the boots I'll be focusing mainly on the upper edges along here like so. So next we'll now be painting the raised sections on the wood stock of the weapon there, and we're painting these with fur brown. So for this step I'm using my detail brush, and I'll be using this to pick out the raised sections on the wood stock there, and just gently highlight them like so, making sure not to overspill into the recesses. So now that the highlights are complete, I'll now be washing over all of the leather areas and also the wooden weapon stock. I'll be washing over all of these areas with strong tone ink. So using my regiment brush again, I'm just going to be liberally applying the wash over all of the leather areas, making sure that it gets into the recesses and creates some nice shading and also blending of the highlights as well. So next we'll now be moving on to the loincloth, the edging around the quilted areas there as well, and also the wraps on the handle, and we're painting all of these areas with ash grey. So for this step I'm using my detail brush, and this is mainly just so I avoid overspilling onto the other areas, and I'll just be lightly highlighting the trim just along there as well, and also painting onto the loincloth there as well. Now it's probably a good idea, as this is quite a lighter paint, to apply several thinned washes as opposed to one thick one, and this will give you the best coverage possible. So once the first base layer is dry, we'll now be performing a highlight using a mixture of ash grey and matte white, mixing around about 50-50 quantities. We'll be highlighting all of the areas we've painted with ash grey in the previous step. So for this step I'll be focusing on the folds, the raised section of the folds in the tabard here, and just gently picking them out to create some shading. And also I'll be painting along the edges of the trim and also along the edges of the wraps around the handle as well. So the next step is to wash over all the grey areas with soft tone ink. So I'm using my Regiment brush once again for the wash, and I'll be applying this wash all over the grey areas, and this will create a nice greyish brown look, as well as applying some nice shading to the areas. So next we'll be painting the skin areas, and we'll be base coating them with tanned flesh. So for this step I'm using my character brush, and I've mixed a small amount of water into the mix just to improve the flow, and I'll be painting on a couple of thin layers, and this will create a really nice and even coverage across the skin areas. So with the first layer of the skin completed, we'll now be performing a second layer. Now we'll be using a mixture of barbarian flesh and also tan flesh mixed in 50-50 quantities, and we're applying this over the skin areas, leaving the original tan flesh visible in the recesses. So for this step I'm using my character brush, and I'm just going to be focusing the paint on the raised edges, making sure I leave the original tan flesh visible in the recesses, and just painting this over the skin areas like so. So the final highlight for the skin is to apply a straight highlight of barbarian flesh. So this highlight will be focusing mainly on the raised edges of the skin, so such as the nose here, and as such I'm using my detail brush here. I'm just going to be focusing on the nose and just on the upper cheeks as well, just painting a small amount like so. The final step for painting the skin is to apply a wash of flesh wash across the entire skin area. So using my character brush I'll be applying the wash across all the skin, and this will help to blend in the highlights as well as creating some additional shading. So the final area that we're painting on this miniature is of course the beard, and for the base coat we'll be using Chaotic Red. So for this stage I'm using my character brush. Now the reason for this is I don't want to overspill into any of the areas that I've already painted, so I'm just going to be painting it on like so, just being very careful not to overspill. The next step is to highlight the beard with Lava Orange. So for this step I'll be using my detail brush, and I'll just be using this to pick out the individual strands almost to the raised areas of the beard, just gently painting over them like so. Being very careful not to overspill onto the areas that we've already painted of course. So the next step for painting the beard is another highlight, and this will be with Lava Orange and also Demonic Yellow, mixing around about 50-50 quantities. So for this step I'm using my detail brush again, and I'm just going to be focusing on the very upper edges of the beard there, just painting the lighter mix of orange just as a highlight across the top. So the final step is to wash over the beard with strong tone ink. So using my character brush I'm just going to be washing over the entirety of the beard, making sure they get into all of the recesses like so. And here we have the completed miniature, and as you can see I've painted the base, and to find out how to do that you can follow my How to Paint Dungeon Saga Bases tutorial, which I'll pop a link for in the description, and also an annotation link on screen now. If you enjoyed this tutorial then let me know in the comments below, and also subscribe to be kept up to date with all the latest Dungeon Saga content. Additionally, if you would like to support me in making more tutorials, you can do so by heading over to my Patreon page and pledging your support there. So until next time, thanks for watching and goodbye.